Well, I was stunned to learn how little was going into saving children's lives. Children were dying of malaria, pneumonia, diarrhea, in many cases where there already was a vaccine, but not being given in the poorest countries where the risk of death was the highest. And so, a child born in Africa was 40 times more likely to die than one born in a rich country. So both creating new vaccines and getting existing vaccines out to all the children of the world became a top priority for our foundation. And with partners, the number of children who die every year has gone from 10 million down to 5 million. And we see a path to get it down a lot further. So vaccines are magic. We got rid of smallpox that was killing millions. There's nothing that saves as many lives as vaccines do.
So you've got plenty of experience in supporting efforts to vaccinate the world. Our program is called How to Vaccinate the World. Clearly, we're focused on this particular group of new vaccines for COVID-19. So how do you vaccinate the world?
Well, let's say that you want to get 2 doses to, like 80% of the world. That's 10 billion doses. And that's a huge increase. So we need to get a lot of vaccine factories going. And the highest volume factories are in India. And so drawing in companies like Serum, Bioe, Bharat that have those factories, even to make vaccines invented by other companies, that's a novel thing, never been done before. But given the urgency, that type of cooperation is required. And so we're helping to fund the Indian companies, and I work with the pharmaceutical CEOs to broker these agreements that will drive up that capacity. And so we don't, have to wait and the rich countries go first, which would be terrible and cause way more deaths than if we get this out very broadly.
I mean, is it simply a case of waiting until a proven vaccine has been demonstrated to work and then building the factories? Or are these factories being built at risk already, or do pre-existing factories do the job? You just need to tweak a couple of nozzles and they'll make a different kind of vaccine.
Well, sadly for the mRNA vaccines, those can't be made in these high-volume factories yet. For the next pandemic, we'll have that figured out, but not this one. So it's the non-mRNA vaccines that are more classic, like AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Novavax, that will give us a lot of the billions and cover the non-rich countries. The AstraZeneca vaccine is actually being made at risk by Serum Institute as we speak in significant volume, and that's because we got resources to them and they stepped forward to take a bit of risk themselves. And so if that's approved by the UK and Indian government, then it won't just be the UK capacity, it'll be this Indian capacity, which is also super large, that will get us up towards those billions of doses.
I mean, it's intriguing that you would think that there's a market for vaccines, and yet there seems to be a lot of money from your foundation, from other foundations, from governments. Do private companies make money from vaccines?
Yes, some vaccines are quite profitable. The pneumonia vaccine that Pfizer makes called Prevnar is a great business for them, which makes sense. That was a brilliant piece of work to create that vaccine. And some of the people who did that work are now at our foundation helping to drive our strategy. A lot of money is going into vaccines to use them against cancer because there's big money in that. In fact, BioNTech, whose technology is in this Pfizer vaccine, their main business is going after cancer, but they have a partnership with our foundation to use whatever they invent for cancer to use it for HIV and TB and other infectious diseases, even though because those are mostly diseases of poor people, there's not a big market. You're not going to make a lot of money off of that.
Is that a problem that then requires assistance? And what sort of assistance is required? If you're basically saying, look, we're developing this vaccine, but none of the people who we want to vaccinate can actually afford to pay for their own doses. Maybe their governments also can't afford to pay for doses, or it's not a priority for the government. So What sort of support is necessary to make that happen?
Yeah, so you have two cases. You have the case where the disease is in the rich world, like HIV, and where you invent these things because of that rich world market, and then you just have to get marginal cost pricing to get it out, without any profit or intellectual property to the developing countries. And that is working for HIV drugs, where, those have become very, very cheap, and then governments, including the UK and the US and our foundation, fund that low-cost procurement and get them out to everyone who's suffering from HIV. If the disease is not in the rich world at all, though, then even the invention part, like, we're the biggest funder of a malaria vaccine because there is no market, because rich countries don't have it. If you travel, you just take a prophylactic drug and don't worry about it. And so, yes, the market won't always maximize the human condition. You need governments and philanthropy to come in for these neglected areas and provide incentives and resources connecting up to the companies that have the deep skills.
I mean, how much money has the Gates Foundation put into vaccines over the years? And is this COVID vaccine, just more of the same, or is it on a different scale in terms of your support?
Well, we put in for vaccines broadly over $40 billion. And, so vaccines are a huge part of what we do. A diarrheal vaccine called rotavirus, a pneumonia vaccine, Prevnar and its competitors, a ton of vaccines, including trying to create, but we're not there yet, vaccines for TB, HIV, and malaria. So we have a great team of people, many of whom retired from the pharma companies and want to get these vaccines out to the developing countries. So usually the work we do is very obscure because it doesn't connect to rich countries much at all. Now the coronavirus has changed that. Tony Fauci was kind of an obscure person. My work, our foundation's work, and wasn't a mainstream thing. But for coronavirus now, everybody cares about getting the global vaccine enterprise moving at full speed.
I was curious as to what impact you think coronavirus is going to have on the profile of vaccines, the industry of vaccines, however you want to phrase it, because on the one hand, I hear very worrying reports that it's really derailed a lot of the vaccination programs that you've been supporting for years. On the other hand, new technologies, new urgency, new interest in the power of vaccines. So do you think it's going to be good or bad for broader vaccination efforts in the long term?
Well, this R&D piece where we've proven out the mRNA platform, that over time we'll figure out how to make it really cheap and scalable and thermostable, that is very good news. We are set back by the coverage of vaccination of young children in poor countries because of all the disruption. And so we're going to have to work hard as we get the disease to go away to restore those vaccination rates. And these countries will be poor because of what's happened to the economy and extra money they've spent. So how much of a setback it is, how long it takes us to get back the vaccination levels that we've been pushing on, hard to say. It might take us 3 years, 5 years before we're back where we were just a year ago.
There are two organisations which are central to the development and distribution of vaccines around the world, and both count the Gates Foundation amongst their founders. They're called CEPI and Gavi. I'll let Bill Gates explain the acronyms.
So Gavi is the Global Alliance for Vaccines, and it buys vaccines for the poorest country. It goes back to the year 2000. The UK government's the biggest funder. Our foundation's the second biggest funder. It is unbelievable how successful it's been in saving lives. And so it's also gotten involved in helping buy a coronavirus vaccine for the poor countries. CEPI is much more recent. In 2015, after the Ebola epidemic, a lot of countries were talking about, hey, how do we move forward? And the UK, Norway, Japan, Wellcome Trust, which is an amazing foundation, and our foundation were the funders of this CEPI. It's the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness. And they fund R&D, including saying, okay, how could we, if there was a surprise pathogen, how could we make a vaccine quickly? So that, that investment has been very helpful. And CEPI, after the U.S. government's been the second biggest funder of these coronavirus vaccines. And I'm hoping that charter and the resources get expanded to use CEPI so we are far more ready for the next epidemic.
On the subject of CEPI and epidemic preparedness, I've seen your TED Talk from a few years ago where you warned everybody there's going to be another pandemic, it's going to be bad, we're not ready.
To move fast, do logistics, and secure areas. We need to do simulations, germ games, not war games, so that we see where the holes are. The last time a germ game was done in the United States was back in 2001, and it didn't go so well. So far, the score is germs 1, people 0.
Did we get ready in time? It doesn't feel like we were ready, but...
No, absolutely not. No, I listed 10 things that wouldn't have been that expensive to do. One of the 10, which is the creation of CEPI, was done. And so we were better off for having done that. But by and large, because Ebola didn't hit the rich countries hardly at all, it scared them a little bit. There were a few cases, but people went back to their normal business, hoping that somebody else was worrying about the next pandemic. So, I wish I could have gotten my message across better, but I did not.
Was that, do you think, a lack of sort of intellectual awareness? We didn't do the right research, we didn't do the right kind of war games and the right scenario planning, or did we know but we simply it just wasn't a priority? We weren't willing to put the hard yards in. We weren't willing to spend the money.
Well, the awareness of things like the Spanish flu 100 years ago. It may be that's mostly medical experts that say, hey, wow, people are traveling more now than ever. The population's greater. And so anything like that would be far worse. And you've got to worry about somebody intentionally creating some bioterrorism agent. And so I think it's amazing how we didn't get serious about it. One of the tactics was to do these germ simulation, pandemic simulations like they do war games. And we brought that to Davos to show people that, wow, we haven't thought through how we would respond to this thing. Now that it's hit the rich countries, I think for a generation we'll not only fund the R&D, but also fund a core of people, like 3,000 people, who have the skills and work on normal infectious diseases like polio and malaria that can be diverted with incredible capability as soon as there's a hint of a new pandemic. So between R&D, better surveillance, and this pandemic core of 3,000 people, I'm actually quite optimistic that we can avoid what's happened this year.
Yeah, we would do better if there was a pandemic in 2 years' time, you think? We've learned a few lessons.
Yeah, if you catch a pandemic early, then the pandemic is like it was in Australia or New Zealand or Taiwan. It's not a big deal. It's when you let it exponentially grow to these big numbers that then it overwhelms your hospitals, you can't do contact tracing. And so the countries that had SARS or MERS, some of them actually did get the diagnostic testing, contact tracing up, and their situation is utterly different than most other countries.
Yeah, I've been fascinated by the psychology of SARS and the response of the countries who were hit by SARS, because I think it seems for them it was wow, that was really bad. That really hit our economy. It could have been so much worse. We need to prepare. Whereas for those of us in the West, more distant, the lessons seem to have been different. The lessons seem to have been, oh yeah, these things come along, and people like Bill Gates always make a fuss, and it's all fine in the end. And SARS was fine in the end. We learned a different lesson.
That's right. When a small earthquake comes, does it make you think they'll all be small, or does it mean you do the building codes and get ready for the big one? For wars, we invest a lot. For fires, we invest a lot. But now pandemics, at some level, we'll expect our governments to have experts and think ahead so that there is no repeat.
The US has tried to be at the forefront of funding the whole development of COVID vaccines with Operation Warp Speed. At the same time, political leadership in the US seems to have been sitting on the sidelines. What difference has that made to fighting the pandemic? And do you think the incoming administration of President Biden is going to change anything meaningful?
Well, I'm thrilled at the three goals that President-elect Biden has outlined in terms of getting the vaccine out, getting mask use up for 100 days, and getting schools back. I do think that they'll have a more consistent set of experts and be more willing to deliver bad news when that's the appropriate thing. The U.S., the one category we get an A in is the funding of the R&D. That started as BARDA, then got renamed Warp Speed, but that's where the U.S. was better than other countries. And only CEPI really did much besides the U.S. on that type of funding. But in terms of the execution, no, we did not do a good job. We'll be doing the postmortem about why we didn't get our testing capacity up in March and April, because we have more of those machines than any country by a lot. But I am enthused about the new team that's coming in and that they'll help accelerate the end of the pandemic.
Now, I wanted to come back to this question of doses of vaccine for poorer countries. There was this brief moment where everyone just got very excited. We've got these new vaccines. It looks like they work. That's brilliant. Let's get them rolled out. Let's get them rolled out in the UK. Let's get them rolled out in rich countries. And governments of rich countries seem to be cutting deals with the vaccine developers, pre-ordering a load of doses. Is that just inevitable? Rich countries, they've got the money, they're accountable to their own voters, or is there a better way to do it?
Well, the best way to do it is to have so much capacity that it's not a zero-sum game. No matter who they go to, you don't want to have so little vaccine. And that's where, it's good news that these high-volume factories can make these other vaccines, and that's where we're going to get many billions of doses made in calendar 2021, is because of those second source agreements. So the capacity is the thing to really work on. Trying to convince rich countries that they, should not take many doses, I think that's going to be hard. To some degree, they funded the R&D. I don't think they should, take all the capacity, but they will get a little ahead in line. But with these other factories, the difference won't be dramatic, and that'll save millions of lives.
One way that vaccines will be distributed to low and middle-income countries is through an initiative called COVAX, a public-private alliance coordinated by Gavi, CEPI and the WHO. The aim is to provide equitable access to 2 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines by the end of next year to countries that would struggle to purchase these vaccines on their own. Now, I've tried to understand how it's meant to work, but it all seems either vague or complicated or both. I wondered if Bill Gates thought it was working as it was meant to.
We don't have anywhere near the $38 billion that we said we'd like to raise for that yet. As the U.S. comes in with support from President Biden, I think we'll do a lot better. The core of it, I agree we've made it too complicated. But the core of it is for the poorest countries, which are these Gavi-eligible countries, there will be donated money. The vaccine companies will sell at the marginal cost of manufacture. So at least for the poorest countries, they're not making profit or even getting paid back for their fixed costs. That's what's called the Gavi Advanced Market Commitment. That part, I think, really comes through, and I'm quite optimistic that we'll get that piece to be fully funded.
And things have been looking pretty encouraging just the last few weeks. But how much is it going to cost if something goes wrong, if the vaccination program just doesn't work globally, there's some problem? How serious would that be?
Well, the beauty of having lots of vaccines is that, even in the awful case that one of them turns out not to work as well as we expected, or, there's some side effect that we haven't seen yet, we have lots and lots of these efforts. And so I'm confident that overall the vaccine effort will succeed, including getting up to those numbers. At worst, it would be a multi-month delay if a factory or one construct does get into some difficulty.
I've been very interested in the conversation around big pharma and these vaccines. A lot of people very excited at the progress that's been made, and wow, the technology is amazing, this is unprecedented. But I've already seen pieces saying they're going to make too much money, they shouldn't have the intellectual property to these patents, we need to get the maximum number of vaccines to the maximum number of people, and that means stripping or suspending intellectual property from pharmaceutical companies. What do you feel about those arguments?
Well, pricing of medicines is a complex topic that sound bites don't do it justice. There are drugs, like HIV drugs, that can be made generically, and the companies gave up all their intellectual property because there is capacity by the generics to make those, which is quite simple. Here with vaccines, getting rid of the intellectual property wouldn't do anything because it's all about which vaccine is funded in a high-quality trial and who's got these exquisitely complex factories to make this stuff without any impurities, which is dramatically harder than making normal drugs. And so, although you can talk about intellectual property, that's not what's holding back this vaccine. It's not like there's some factory that's what is limiting their ability to participate here.
Now, every week on this program, we have a feature called What Our Editor Doesn't Understand. And so I asked him, what don't you understand about Bill Gates? And he said what he doesn't understand is why there are so many really weird conspiracy theories about you. Do you understand why people believe these crazy things?
Well, up until a year ago, those theories didn't exist. I mean, there were theories that I was a tough boss or that Microsoft should have done this or that differently. But that was about it. It's really this pandemic that is scary to people and has them searching for oversimplistic explanations, along with the power of social media, that I think explains why there's a phenomena there that's a bit scary to me and that I wouldn't have expected. But it's kind of new, and I'm hoping it goes away once we get the pandemic finished.
Yeah, I mean, do you remember the first time you saw one of these theories? How did it feel?
Well, it felt almost like somebody was playing a joke on me, to be frank. The idea that I make monies off of vaccines, or there's some microchipping, so, I know people's locations, or it's population control. It's all pretty evil, twisted stuff. But there's a lot of that. That QAnon stuff is not, normal thinking. And, we have to make sure truth travels more rapidly than, overly simplistic, crazy ideas.
As this is our last program of 2020, before I wrapped up my conversation with Bill Gates, I couldn't pass up the only chance I may ever have to ask a billionaire what his plans are for New Year's Eve.
Well, I certainly won't be at a party or anything because we'll still be in the thick of the epidemic.
And when do you think the pandemic will have been driven to an end by widespread vaccination? When are we going to call this over?
Well, in the rich countries, summer next year, things should be dramatically better with a lot of things reopening. I think there will be some restrictions out into the first half of 2022 because we've got to stop the disease worldwide. either get down to very few cases or 0 cases. We're not sure which. But, before you're going to have tourists coming to your country or, the global economy going at full speed, we've got to get this global coverage going. And so accelerating, that, which, that's assuming we need 2 doses, 10 billion doses of vaccine. There's a lot of hard work between now and then, but, we are at the beginning of the end.
An encouraging thought to take into 2021. I'd like to thank my guest this week, Bill Gates. Next week, I'll be talking to the eminent epidemiologist Larry Brilliant about his part in the successful effort to eradicate smallpox and what lessons we need to learn to try to halt the spread of COVID-19. How to Vaccinate the World is available as a podcast and via BBC Sounds. Thank you for listening, and from me, Tim Harford, and the team, have a very happy new year.
How to Vaccinate the World was presented by Tim Harford. The producer was Sandra Canthal, the editor was Richard Varden, and it was mixed by Nigel Appleton.